Guten Abend. Willkommen am Wiener Judenplatz anlässlich der diesjährigen Rede an Europa, gehalten von Lea Ypi. Mein Name ist Boris Marte, ich vertrete die ERSTE Stiftung und im Namen der Wiener Festwochen, des Instituts für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen, des Jüdischen Museums und der ERSTE Stiftung darf ich Sie zur Rede an Europa 2025 am Judenplatz begrüßen. Good evening. A warm welcome to this year's speech to Europe by Lea Ypi. My name is Boris Martin. I represent the ERSTE Foundation. On behalf of Wiener Festwochen, the Institute of Human Sciences, the Jewish Museum, and the ERSTE Foundation, I warmly welcome you to the Judenplatz on the occasion of a speech to Europe 2025. Simon Wiesenthal, der Initiator dieses Mahnmals am Judenplatz zur Erinnerung an den Holocaust und zum Gedenken an die ermordeten Juden, schrieb aus Anlass der Eröffnung dieses Judenplatzes im Jahr 2000. Mögen sich an diesem Ort in Zukunft Wienerinnen, Österreicher und Österreicherinnen, Menschen aus aller Welt, Angehörige verschiedener Religionen und gesellschaftlichen Schichten ihrer Verantwortung für ein friedliches Miteinander bewusst werden und diese Aufgabe annehmen und erfüllen. Simon Wiesenthal, das tun wir auch heute wieder. Gedenken, Erinnerung ist kein Akt der Repräsentation, sondern ein dialogischer Prozess. Seit 2019 richten jedes Jahr Rednerinnen und Redner vom Wiener Judenplatz aus ihre Botschaften an Europa. Simon Wiesenthal, the initiator of this Holocaust monument on the Wiener Judenplatz, wrote on the occasion of its unveiling in the year 2000. In the future, it may be here, this place, that people from Vienna, Austria, and all over the world, those belonging to different religions and from all walks of life, are awakened to their responsibility to coexist peacefully, and that they take on and fulfill this duty. Today, once again, we do exactly that. Commemoration isn't just about presenting the past. It is a dialogical process. Every year since 2019, a different speaker has addressed the people of Europe from here, from the Wiener Judenplatz. Wir freuen uns ganz besonders, Lea Ypi als diesjährige Rednerin gewonnen zu haben. Sie ist Politikwissenschaftlerin und Philosophin. Lea Ypi forscht unter anderem zu Demokratie und Migration. Ihr preisgekröntes Memoir Frei wurde in mehr als 35 Sprachen übersetzt und fand internationale Anerkennung. Es ist eine sehr persönliche und philosophische Reflexion über Freiheit, Identität und die Herausforderung des politischen Wandels. Wir, die Organisatorinnen der Rede an Europa, freuen uns sehr, dass so viele von Ihnen gekommen sind, um dieser Rede an Europa 2025 beizuwohnen. Today's speaker is Lea Ypi. She's a political scientist and a philosopher. Her award-winning memoir, Free, has been translated into over 35 languages and gained international acclaim. It is a very personal account and reflection on freedom, identity, and the challenges of living through political change. We, die Wiener Festwochen, Institut für die Wissenschaften von Menschen und die ERSTE Stiftung, we, the hosts of this public lecture, of this public speech, would like to express our happiness that so many of you have accepted our invitation and join us here on the Wiener Judenplatz 2025. Now, the highlight. Please welcome Lea Ypi. Lea, the stage is yours.
Hi, Vienna. Hello, Europe. Tonight I want to talk to you about migration and identity. And maybe the best way to start that conversation is actually to talk about my own identity. Just to give a presentation of myself, my name is Lea. I'm a professor of political theory at the London School of Economics. When I grow up, I want to be a writer. I grew up in Albania, and I now live in the United Kingdom. When I'm in Albania, I'm the English. When I'm in England, I'm the Albanian. When I speak to women, I'm introduced as a woman, often as a working woman. When I speak to mothers, I'm introduced as a mother. Sometimes I'm introduced as an Albanian with a Muslim family. And sometimes as something very different from a Muslim, although still an M, a Marxist. And sometimes I'm introduced as another M, a migrant. But I actually want to start somewhere else, not with how people introduce me, and not with what people think I am, but what I would like to be. And as it happens, what I would like to be is also what I would like Europe to be. So, what do I want to be? And what do I want Europe to be? A statue. A statue? Well, to be more precise, the spirit that this statue embodies. Some of you will know that the term statue comes from the Latin verb stare, which means to stand, because statues stand in a fixed place. But it can also be connected to another word with the same root as stare, status. And status, in this case, is introduced as standing, and that means the occupying of a certain condition, the symbol of a certain way of being. So statues don't just stand so we can look at them, or actually more likely these days take selfies in front of them. They are there because through the action or the person that they depict, they symbolize a certain status or a certain condition. And it's a condition that we think deserves to be remembered and carried with us in some form. So the condition that I want Europe to reflect is the condition of being human. Not as humans are, but as they could be. Not in reality, but as an ideal. And the statue that I have in mind, the statue I want to be, the statue that embodies that condition, is actually a statue that you all know. And in fact, you can all admire it right now. But actually save the selfies from later. So it's standing in front of me, and right behind you, right here on Judenplatz. So if some of you turn your heads and look behind your shoulders, and those of you who are standing behind look in front of you, you actually won't be able to avoid that statue. So this statue, you're very welcome to look at it for 10 seconds, because I'm going to talk about it, is depicting a man on a pedestal, and as you can see, his right leg is slightly raised, he has a foot resting upon a step, and he has the palm of his hand fully open, slightly stretched, and brought forwards towards you as if he's trying to shake your hand. He's opening himself to you, and he's actually signaling that he's your friend. So he looks at you from a certain height, higher than me, higher than all of us. But if you look at his expression, it's not an expression of arrogance. It's not an expression of paternalism or condescension. It's a kind of expression of human sympathy, and also an expression of deep concern. So the statue is of the writer Gotthold Ephraim Lessing. Lessing was one of the most eminent representatives of the age that we call the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is sometimes defined as the age of reason, and sometimes captured in the motto, sapere aude, to have the courage to think for yourself, in a public spirit, stepping outside fixed identities and social roles. Now, the Enlightenment is much vilified these days, both from the left and from the right. It's vilified from the left because it's considered and associated in particular by the post-colonial left, who blame the Enlightenment for the brutality, domination, and paternalism that often characterized encounters with European states in other parts of the world, and it's vilified by the right because the courage to think for oneself has always been a kind of threat to passive submission. Now, I think there's some truth to the left criticism, the one that associates the Enlightenment to colonialism and to civilizing missions of the West in other parts of the world, but actually there is very little nuance to that position. The Enlightenment was eventually instrumentalized by elites for these exploitative missions, but at the beginning, when Lessing was writing, it actually embodied a really subversive stance. And there's no better proof of this than Lessing himself. His works were banned during his life, and after his death, the controversy over his alleged pantheism led to a wider attack on the Enlightenment conception of reason. And it was a kind of attack that was taken up by reactionaries of all sorts in the 2 centuries that followed, and that culminated in an outright ban of Lessing's work in the fascist Europe of the 1930s. And this very statue is a reconstruction. The original was actually removed by the Nazis and melted down in 1939. Now, one of Lessing's most famous plays, as you will know, is Nathan the Wise. And it touches on some of the themes that I want to talk to Europe about today: identity and displacement, culture and conflict, migration and cosmopolitanism. So let me start saying something about the play. It's set in Jerusalem during one of the Crusades, and its main character, Nathan, is a Jew who lives under Muslim rule and brings up an orphaned Christian girl. His own family, Nathan's own family, his wife and 7 sons have been murdered by Christians. And in his absence, his house has been burned. And yet, throughout the play, Nathan has no resentment, or seems to harbor no resentment towards either the Christians or the Muslims, and refuses to be defined by his identity. And he constantly asks the reader, isn't it enough to be a human? At one point, Nathan is summoned by the Sultan, who has heard of his great wisdom, and wants to hear from him which of these great three monotheistic religions is superior. Is it Christianity? Is it Judaism? Is it Islam? And Nathan patiently explains that actually the right answer consists not in the past, but in the future. He says this answer can't be given in a conservative way, based on tradition or existing values or inherited history, because actually he says, you know, each history will look superior to the insider, but will look very, very different to an outsider. And so the truth of all cultures, if one can speak of truth at all, is only reconstructed, Nathan says, by expanding your outlook and by thinking about the future in this ongoing test. And the test is the following: whichever culture continues to display the virtues of humanity, to remove prejudice, to show the love that its foundational texts promise, to encourage tolerance in future generations, that might be the right one. And if all of them do that, then all of them are the right ones. And throughout the play, Nathan rejects being labeled. This is a quote from the play. We will be friends, he says at one point to a Christian knight who is pressing him. Come on, Nathan, who are you? What are you? And then Nathan says, and again, another quote, we didn't choose a nation for ourselves. Are we our nations? What is a nation? Were Jews and Christians that before they were human? These are all the questions that he asks. But there's one point in the play in which Nathan actually gets angry and is no longer as wise as it seems to kind of lose his temper. And this occurs in the very opening lines of the play, when he comes back from his travels around, and the woman who greets him says, again, quote from the play, "Thank God you have returned at last." And that's the point where Nathan gets angry, and he says, yeah, but what do you mean, at last? Did I intend, or was it possible to come back sooner? I was forced to travel, he says. So as you can see here, there is one categorization that Nathan the Wise struggles to reject. There's one kind of identity. And that is the identity of a migrant. And even more specifically, of the migrant with no choice. Because displacement, he says, is not a voluntary act. So a migrant is both a citizen of the world and a citizen of nowhere. A migrant is both open to the world and alienated by it. He has to abandon, or she has to abandon familiar ways of being and has to learn new ones. And the migrant must also live in this constant, permanent state of anxiety about whether you actually ever really fully belong. And the migrants amongst you will know this feeling. So belonging is always a kind of aspiration, something that for Lessing was captured by the spirit of Enlightenment cosmopolitanism. And yet, Nathan is a good migrant. First of all, he actually obeys the laws of the countries that he visits. Second, he's rich. Third, he doesn't try to settle elsewhere. So that's what makes him a good migrant. He eventually goes back to where he comes from. So returns to his home, even if it's late. So tonight, I want to talk to you about a different kind of migrant. Not about the good migrants, or not just about the good migrants, but also about the bad migrants, the ones that I have crossed paths with. And I want to talk to you about it in the spirit of Lessing, in the spirit of actually showing the absurdity of applying the categories of good and bad migrants, and of the kind of slippery slope that is involved whenever we try to do that. A slippery slope that closes the future, closes the past, and opens up to the future if it goes right, and if it goes wrong, it opens up the past and closes the future. So when I was growing up in Albania in the 1990s, the father of one of my best friends was a smuggler. We used to call him Ben the Lame. Now, Ben the Lame hadn't always been a smuggler. Before the country made the transition from a communist state to a liberal one, he used to work shifts in a dockyard where he would make fishing nets and repaint boats. And actually, Ben didn't look like a smuggler. You know, he was really tiny and anemic, and he walked on a limp. He didn't look like a smuggler. He didn't choose to be a smuggler. The privatization reforms that followed the collapse of the regime forced dockyard managers to make redundancies. So Ben and his wife found themselves unemployed. Ben didn't look like a smuggler. He didn't choose to be a smuggler. And actually, he didn't even think of himself as a smuggler. It was just a job, like any other. As far as he was concerned, he was paid to help people on small boats reach Italy. And he needed money to feed his children. And he was a little afraid, but he wasn't ashamed of this activity. Because for decades, Albanians had been murdered by their state whenever they tried to cross the border. And in the very few cases in which people succeeded, the relatives that were left behind were deported. So finally, Albanians were free, and Ben was helping them realize their dreams. And actually, he spoke of this with kind of pride. So one night, Ben the Lame disappeared and never came back. Some people said he was killed. Other people said that he drowned in the Adriatic and that he was eaten by these same fishes that he used to build nets for. And then eventually, much later, the family gave up hoping that Ben would return, because he wasn't Nathan, after all. He wasn't the good migrant, he was the bad one. So there was a funeral for him. It was a funeral without a body, just with a kind of empty coffin. And a lot of people came to the funeral and said, well, they were very grateful that he had helped their relatives escape, because he had offered them a possibility of choosing another life somewhere else. And they said that remittances, that these relatives that Ben had helped, were helping in turn families that were left behind to just survive and stay afloat. And they also spoke about how the times had changed, about how in the past we had been told that we couldn't travel because we didn't have passports, and the state denied the passports. And just when the Cold War came to an end, state socialism was abandoned. And just at that point, the state, our state, recognized the right to leave. And then suddenly, people discovered that actually having a passport wasn't enough, because you also needed a visa, for which your own state was not responsible. This was the responsibility of another state. So the West had spent decades criticizing the East for closing its borders. It had funded campaigns to demand freedom of movement. It had condemned the immorality of states that were committed to restricting their citizens' right to leave. And our exiles actually used to be received like heroes. And then suddenly, overnight, the rhetoric changed. The heroes had become criminals. So they had become from being champions of freedom to being dangerous subversives who were threatening the European way of life. But these people who decided to emigrate, they did it because they were attracted to that way of life. They didn't pose a threat to the system. They actually were the biggest supporters of this system. So here's my question. If freedom is a value, if freedom of movement is a kind of freedom, surely that freedom matters both in emigration and in immigration. So both to leave your country and to enter another country. So if I tell you all, you're free to leave this square, but actually, as it happens, all the roads that would enable you to get out of this area of the city end up being policed, and you can't, do you actually really have freedom of movement? So just when former socialist states were no longer shooting their citizens at the border, capitalist countries started to send patrol boats on the seas. So in one direction or in the other direction, the migrants were dying. And what had changed? Just the color of the uniforms, just the flags under which these crimes were perpetrated. Now, border guards and patrol boats and the detention and repression of immigrants that was once condemned outside Western liberal states is now the standard practice in all these countries. And actually, these measures now, they aren't just tolerated, they're celebrated as a sign of strength of the West. And the West has actually perfected this system of excluding the most vulnerable and attracting the most skilled, all the while pursuing the rhetoric of being tough on borders and being really proud when they can of exactly this. We exclude the vulnerable and we attract the skilled. So let me tell you a little bit about how things look on the other side, on the side of those who leave. Since the end of the Cold War, migration has been both a blessing and a curse for a lot of states around the world. It's been a blessing because without remittances from migrants, their families would have struggled with the devastating impact of the neoliberal shock therapy reforms that promised to turn failed communist states into capitalist paradise. And it's actually been a curse because Lessing is right. You don't really choose to be a migrant. Also because, contrary to what anti-migration propaganda would have you believe, actually no one enjoys endangering themselves and their families and leaving their country just for the sake of annoying you all. And forget about the dangers of unauthorized crossings. Even where legal routes are available, migration breaks apart families. Brain drain is a kind of open wound. Every year, the state invests in doctors and in nurses who abandon their country, lured by higher salaries and better living conditions in the West. So if you happen to support a selective immigration system, or if you agree that your country has to attract skilled migrants, what you're doing is you're actually effectively endorsing a form of exploitation. What that actually means is that somewhere in a faraway place, people will work and they will pay taxes for their doctors to be trained so they can look after not their sick people, but your sick people. And they will work and they will pay for their teachers to educate not their children, but your children. And their care homes will suffer shortages so that old people here can continue to live and enjoy adequate care. And research centers and universities there will suffer so that the universities here can flourish with people like me and people like the other migrants who I'm sure are here on the same premises for the same reason. So borders are said to be the definitive problem of our time. And borders are a problem, but not because there is a civilizational question that we have to solve to decide who belongs and who doesn't belong. And not because there is a problem of adaptation by some cultural groups and not other cultural groups. And definitely not because, as Giorgia Meloni recently told Donald Trump, Europe's aim should be to make the West great again, and not because migration is a challenge to that goal. And actually, there is nothing more insulting to the wisdom of Nathan the Wise, with which I began, that this very idea, this idea that there's one civilization, one way of life that embodies the truth and the values of living together. And I hate to break it to you, not even European civilization. So as Nathan insists with the Christian knight in the play, he says, quote, "All lands produce good people." And then the knight gets really annoyed and starts challenging him. And he says, "Sure, but come on, here are more good people than there." And Nathan rejects this as well, because he knows that this greatness, this making something great again, eventually comes with a cost. And the cost of this cultural hierarchy is exactly the destruction of the other, the destruction of anyone who is perceived to be a threat and unlikely to fit. And if you're in any doubt about what that cost looks like, when it's taken to its extreme consequences, just look at something else. This memorial. A memorial to the victims of the most devastating project of making something great again that humanity has ever known, the Holocaust. This is also a product of European Western values, by the way. It's also the product of a project that promised to purge society of all its unwanted elements: Jews, communists, the disabled, homosexuals, basically anyone who was not deemed to fit. So surely this has to be the point about any discussion on migration in Europe. Not the effort to distinguish between the good migrant and the bad migrant, the migrant who is useful and the migrant who is useless, the migrant who is a benefit and the migrant who is a burden, the migrant who obeys the law, the migrant who breaks the law, the economic migrant, the asylum seeker, the migrant who only comes to stay for a little bit and then goes back home, and then the migrant who just can't go away, the migrant who deserves hospitality and the migrant who has to face deportation. Because to reckon with migration as a problem is to understand that it's not a problem as such. And it's also to understand this dangerous, slippery slope that is involved in normalizing this very stance in political discourse. So, we do a little bit of research. If you look at migration in terms of data and in terms of numbers and flows, all the data for a number of years now has suggested that while the number of people that live outside the country of birth has been increasing in absolute terms, this rise is actually completely in line with global population. If you look at the contribution of migrants in societies, there is also very little research that suggests that they are a burden in absolute terms, because all of you will know migrants help counter demographic decline, they pay into social security systems, they contribute to host societies, and actually this also applies to irregular migrants if there are paths to naturalization. When they commit crimes, it's because they don't really have a choice, because they're left out at the margins of society. And of course, if you ask yourself, irregular migration is a problem, but there's a very easy way to resolve the problem of irregular migration, which is just give visas to people. Then they don't need to run away. But migration is still involved as a problem in political discourse, and the problem is political. It's not cultural, and has nothing to do with the migrants themselves, but everything to do with the crisis of liberal democracy. A crisis that the migrants didn't bring, which is not deepening because of them, And if anything, it's the other way around. So what is the problem? If migrants are not the problem, what is the problem? The problem is the hegemony of the right in the discourse on migration, and then this kind of inability, this lack of courage, to return to Lessing and the Enlightenment, to actually think critically, to just think beyond the ideology and the propaganda and all the attempts that try to convince people otherwise. And still, you don't have an alternative, because even people who reject specific policies on migration have actually bought into the politics of migration. So you can reject the policies, but if you've bought into the discourse, you won't get out of it. And that's also because a lot of progressives have abandoned universalism. And so instead of challenging the terms with which migration is framed, they basically just give you their own interpretation of the problem. And also because the left has dropped the language of class, which is a universal language, and has bought into the language of culture. And because it has replaced a socioeconomic diagnosis of what's the problem here with a cultural one, with an identity-based one. So it's not news to anyone on this square that for a long time liberal societies have been failing on a lot of fronts. And I will only list 3, or I could also list 30, but I'll just list the top 3. The first one is the failure of democratic politics. Basically the gap between the representatives, the people we elect, and the represented, the people that elect politicians. And the party system that looks increasingly like a business cartel, where the relationship between politicians and the people is basically like the relationship of businesses to customers. So, you try and see what people like, what goes well, which photos they enjoy, what images they're more likely to respond to, and then you draw your policies based on that. The second failure is the failure of social justice. And that's basically an economic system that is unable to cater to the concerns of the most vulnerable, both citizens and non-citizens, and actually to just manage an economy that works for everyone. And to fight against the organized interests of oligarchs, of big capital, of wealthy donors on which these parties depend, on corporate digital platforms, basically anyone who uses their money to just buy political influence. And the third failure is the failure of international solidarity. So basically the incapacity of progressives to offer an alternative vision of a global order that includes an international reform of institutions that can serve vulnerable people in both parts of the world, in the rich part of the world and in the poor part of the world. So basically the problem, as I see it, is that we have chosen a model of society which is at odds with this humanism that is characteristic of Lessing, where basically the pursuit of profit subordinates all relations between human beings to the demands of the market. And then what happens is you have a political community that blames its failures on those who are not part of it, or have no claim to be part of it, or are seen as undeserving to be part of it. And that political community, if it does that, it doesn't need to take responsibility for its failures. Because what it does, it just continues to blame these failures on these vulnerable people, which it also keeps out legally, and then pretend to have solutions only once those are just gone away, once the other is no longer a threat. So this is the promise of the right. That's where their solution comes. They say, if you solve this question of who belongs, you're done. You will have solved the conflicts of our time. But remember, migration is not the source of the problem. It's actually a symptom. It's not where the crisis comes from. It's revealing of what the crisis is. And that's where the failure of the alternative is, because the question of progress in politics is now basically seen just as a question of abstract law and rights, and of who makes these laws and who shapes them, and of who is included and who is excluded. So, in other words, the response from the left has also become this effort to regulate the terms of political membership. So migration is seen as a problem because political membership is seen as a solution. And culture wars become so important because they are about policing the boundaries of a social group, including getting to say who can speak on behalf of that group. So if you're a woman, you can only speak about women. If you're black, you can only speak about black, and so on. And actually, it's really not difficult to deconstruct this discourse on migration. Borders are not a problem because human beings, like other animals, just like to move around. And also because borders have always been, and will continue to be, open for some people and closed for other people. And actually, and this is my next point, the very approach that the right takes to the issue of migration completely confirms this point. So let me tell you about two dominant trends in migration that make this point. The first one is about the very poor. Even if you forget about these current projects to deport failed asylum seekers to third states, basically the path to citizenship is no longer straightforward, even for regular migrants. Why? Because you have minimum income requirements to qualify for residence, because you have linguistic and you have civic integration tests when applying for citizenship, and these are all obstacles that increase the more vulnerable you are, and that basically condemn vulnerable people to being permanent second-class members of these host societies. And so at this level, with all these hurdles, what migration is on this trend, it's just a war against the most vulnerable. And why is that? Well, there's a very simple reason for that. Because as it happens, when people don't have rights, they're a lot easier to exploit. Now, let me tell you about the other side, the second trend, which applies to the very rich. For these guys, it's usually guys, mostly, borders have never been more open. It's very easy to get citizenship in another state just by buying it. Think about a recent example. In the very same weeks in which the White House was posting videos of irregular migrants literally in chains being deported on planes, in that same week, Donald Trump announced what plan? The plan to sell residence to millionaires. And the path to citizenship, which cost the very modest sum of $5 million. And that enabled rich people to apply for these so-called gold green cards. And that's not an exception. The United States is not an exception. Across the world, financial investors, property developers, individuals who just pay a lot of money in exchange for a different passport are usually put on an accelerated path to naturalization. I know this because when I applied for British citizenship, I was offered, I didn't have the money at the time, still don't have the money, but I was offered to have border security people come to my house to take my fingerprints and everything for some amount of money that I now don't remember because I didn't have it. So the hope of social democracy in the early 20th century was that basically democracy would bring to us this abolition of class differences and also gender and race differences. And in the words of the German politician and Marxist theorist Eduard Bernstein, the founding father of social democracy, I quote, "The parties and the classes that support them soon learn to recognize the limits of their power." And the right to vote, these early social democrats thought, is what makes people kind of partners in a joint cooperative enterprise which works for the good of the political community as a whole. And this was the dawn of this age in which citizenship was removing barriers based on property. Remember, in the 19th century, you had to have property qualifications, you had to have money, you had to speak the language, you had to read and write well to become a citizen, and those barriers were all removed. Suddenly people who had dialects only, people who didn't have the income could also be citizens. So this was this age in which all the barriers to political mobilization were being removed as a result of the expansion of the franchise. So this was a kind of optimistic age, which, if it ever was justified as an assessment, those same reasons that justified it are no longer now in place. Because if in that golden age of expansive citizenship, democracy promised to heal the politics from these potentially destructive effects of class conflict, in our age, in the age of restrictive citizenship, that struggle can no longer be contained in the standard channels of participation. Why is that? Because once citizenship becomes citizenship only for a few people, a kind of commodity that you buy it and you sell it and you can exchange it, then what happens to democracy? Surprise, surprise, it degenerates into oligarchy in the ancient Greek sense of the term, a regime where the few with money get to call the shots. And when citizenship is bought and sold like that, instead of being a tool for social emancipation, as it was hoped by these early social democrats that it would be, what it becomes is a tool of oppression. And with all due respect to Bernstein, who thought this would never again be the case, this consolidates rather than removing the class character of the state. Now, what does it mean to say that the state has a class character? That's basically, it's a very simple proposition, which is that the state loses the ability to act as the political platform through which conflicts between different social groups are balanced in a fair way. So what does the state become instead? It becomes a tool that is there to reward members of some groups, namely the groups with more money and power, and to discipline and punish everyone else. And so instead of being the tool through which you temper the excesses of the market and you bring equality, when citizenship is bought and sold like that, it just turns into a commodity like every other commodity, and that just destroys the very idea of democracy as it has done. Now, a lot of progressive people around the world are quite silent about this transformation in how we think about citizenship. You don't have many either social democratic policy papers or electoral manifestos that try to think about how to resolve this problem. And that's because civic politics has collapsed into ethnic politics. And that's because the reduction of this universal, progressive ideal of citizenship has turned into a regressive, conservative one. And that reduction just marches forward without anyone stopping it. So what does a genuine alternative require? What does it require? Just refusing to pay Boll. You just don't do it. You say no. You reject the reduction of democracy to membership, and you reject the reduction of political conflict to cultural conflict. And what you do is you try and locate and place the question of migration in the context of the wider social injustices that trigger migration. And you think about how these social injustices are brought about, and you think about the decline of the welfare state, the fact that profit-seeking employers go under impunity and pit poor people against each other. And what you say is just this very simple thing: borders are not a problem as such. Nobody worries about the migration of people from Austria to the United Kingdom. You just don't worry about it. And also vice versa. Maybe in the United Kingdom a little bit more. So migration is only a problem when it goes into kind of asymmetric direction, when the flows are only from one part of the world to another part of the world. And that always happens when there is a reason. What is the reason? People run away from war. They run away from economic meltdown. So they've lost their jobs, like Ben the Lame. They run away from health emergencies. So now that's my questions to Europe. These are the causes of migration: war, economic crisis, health emergency. If you don't want war, why do you fund them? If you don't want financial meltdown, why do you reward the people that profit from it? If you don't want a health crisis, why do you restrict access to medicines and vaccines with copyright patents? Very, very, very simple answers to the problem of asymmetric migration. So the problem isn't the simple existence of borders or the presence of borders that are more open or more closed, or that are open for good people and closed for bad people. The problem is that exclusions within the state and between states support each other and reinforce each other. And what they do is just consolidate a kind of global economic and political order that isn't really challenged at the center, at the core, in the foundations of it. And again, this practice of selling citizenship to the rich and of restricting access to citizenship for the poor tells us a really important story about the relationship between capitalism and democracy. So if we don't change that way of thinking about this relationship, if we don't change the analysis around the problem of democracy under capitalism, basically you enter this slippery slope. And what is the slippery slope? First, they come for irregular migrants. Then they come for resident non-citizens, because they say, they're not integrating well, they don't speak the language, and so on. Then they solve that problem, and they come for citizens with names like, Mohammed and Abdallah, just as they used to single out people with names like Goldschmidt and Levy, because they didn't seem to fit. The name was already a sign of not belonging. So is it that hard to see that this is exactly what goes on and this will go on? This is what will happen if you let this continue? And can you even say that, no, it's not going to happen, it's never going to happen? Can we say that we've never been there before? Just look at this building. This is how it started. So I just want to wrap up and go back to Lessing and to actually emphasize something that is very important, which is that this cosmopolitan stance that Nathan the Wise embodies, I don't think should be confused with either good Samaritanism or with the kind of humanitarian ethics that people sometimes invoke when they talk about migration. It's not about, let's just be nice to migrants. Because the Enlightenment wasn't a project of nicety, of being nice. It was a moral project, but it wasn't just a moral project, it was a political project. And what that political project entailed was the rejection of institutions that don't represent every human being, and the public critique of these ideas that ended up favoring one ethnic group, one religious group, one racial group, one class of people, one political community over another, and that was the spirit of Lessing's cosmopolitanism. So what the Enlightenment did was it kind of urged people to just reject values that don't seem to make sense, to make rational sense. They just don't stand up to rational scrutiny when you ask yourselves, what are the causes of this phenomenon? How do I think about them? Can I generalize it? And it also encouraged people, when it started, to embrace this kind of critical outlook that required them to call out the hypocrisy of people in power and to resist a claim to authority, including the authority of those that promise to have your interests at heart. So this abandonment of the spirit of the Enlightenment, just when it's most needed, is tragic. But it's not a complete coincidence, because actually, obedience always requires ignorance. And actually, ignorance helps submission. It helps obedience. You don't think. Don't stop, don't think. And actually, we can see, because we're increasingly becoming used not to thinking, but just following trends, following ways of saying things. And that's why I started this speech, which I'm now about to wrap up because it's cold and I've gone on for too long. That's why I started by invoking the spirit of this statue. Because sometimes there is more humanity in the stone that is there silently staring at you with his little hand open, trying to be your friend, than in the actions of a lot of European leaders today. Because the values that Europe proclaims so unilaterally, so uncritically, so hypocritically, are just not worth very much if they only apply to a few people. So where should these values be grounded? They should be grounded in a different kind of project. They should be grounded in a kind of broader commitment to a vision of justice, both domestic, both national, but also, importantly, international and cosmopolitan. And they must be grounded on a vision of the future that just rejects longing for this past greatness, that just gives up on this civilizational superiority. I mean, how hard is it to see that there is no civilizational superiority? And that just doesn't compromise with global, cosmopolitan, radical, democratic, egalitarian ideals, all of which are in the Enlightenment. And I think, and this is why I wanted to talk to Europe about migration today, because migration and migration struggles and exactly resisting these simplifications, these efforts to distinguish, these nuances around migration are at the very heart of that struggle. Migration, the conflicts around migration, are on the front line of that struggle. It's there that the promises of the Enlightenment, the promises of Europe, the promises of European values are most critically tested. Not in the promise to make the West great again, but in this commitment to actually serve freedom, really, for everyone, not just a few people with privileges. And so in this political work, to build a world in which nobody is actually forced to leave their homes. Thank you.